Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome you to this year's Sigmund Freud lecture at Berggasse 19. I'm delighted that so many of you have come today, and I would also like to welcome our chairman of the supervisory board, Dr. Franz Jurkovic. And so many members of our advisory board and numerous colleagues and friends and interested people in the audience here on site as well as behind the screens. And I also take the opportunity to thank our societies of friends and welcome Thomas Coate as the president of our American friends in New York. And I would like also to thank the City of Vienna Department for Science and Culture for their continued support of our activities. The annual Sigmund Freud lecture usually takes place around Freud's birthday on the 6th of May. However, the fact that we are meeting here today, a little later in the year, does not change the task to which this series of Freud lectures has been dedicated since its inception. Today, the Sigmund Freud lecture has initiated a total of 50 lectures since the 1970s. Today's lecture brings the total to 51, including contributions by Anna and Ernest Freud, Ernst Gombrich, Siri Hustvedt, Vamik Volkan, Joseph Kossuth, Stefano Bolognini, William Kendridge, Philip Blom, Colette Zeller, and Adam Phillips, to name but a few. It's not the time to name all of them. So this insufficiently short list of our internationally renowned Freud lecturers already indicates the objective of the entire museum program, including the exhibitions. By incorporating Freud's findings on the function of the psyche apparatus and more recent psychoanalytic theory and practice, current conditions of existence and life are illuminated from various scientific perspectives. The view of the arts, as well as those of the cultural and social sciences, are always in demand. As early as 1921, Freud stated that individual psychology is also social psychology, since the mental life of the individual does not exist without a relationship to its social counterpart, the other. Accordingly, also Jürgen Habermas in his essay, Knowledge and Human Interest, Erkenntnis und Interesse, points out that for Freud, sociology is applied to psychology, and that according to Freud, the diagnosis of community neurosis requires above all a precise examination of the cultural processes on which it is based. And as we know, Freud did not distinguish between culture and civilization. The Freud lecture by the eminent literary and cultural scholar Homi Bhabha, entitled On the Decisive Power of Affective Coloring, Trauma, Ethnicity, and the Dance of Death, also points to the fact that the various fields involved in the production of culture will today be part of an interdisciplinary, if not transdisciplinary debate. And such an attitude, which seeks to unite several fields of interest, of environments, as we would call it in system theory, is committed to the greatest possible openness for the study of social cultural developments, and is of particular importance in our time when the crisis erupting worldwide seem to limit the time horizon of human civilization. Before we now have the honor of listening to Homi Bhabha and welcoming him once again at the origin of psychoanalysis, I will hand over to the philosopher, religious scholar, and Freud expert Herman Westerink, who, as a member of our advisory board, will give us a brief introduction to Homi Bhabha's work. I wish us all an interesting and enlightening evening. Thank you.
It is a great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Professor Homi K. Bhabha. We are very honored and excited that he has accepted our invitation to give the 51st Sigmund Freud lecture. Homi Bhabha was born in Mumbai, India, graduated with a BA at the University of Mumbai and pursued a master's and doctorate degree at Christchurch, Oxford University. After lecturing at the Department of English at the University of Sussex, Homi Bhabha worked at several universities in the United States, amongst which the University of Pennsylvania, Dartmouth College, and the University of Chicago. Since 2001, he is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. At that university, he has served, amongst others, as the director of the Humanities Center. He is also a distinguished visiting professor at University College London, corresponding fellow of the British Academy, fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and critic in residence at the London Museum of Fine Arts. He holds honorary degrees from amongst others, Université Paris 8 Vincennes, University College London, Vrije Universiteit Berlin, and the University of Stellenbosch. Homi Bhabha is generally recognized as one of the most important contemporary thinkers in post-colonial theory, not only through the groundbreaking studies Nation and Narration from 1990 and The Location of Time from 1994, but also through numerous edited and co-edited volumes such as Cosmopolitanism from 2014 and Territories and Trajectories, Cultures in Circulation from 2018. At the heart of these writings, one finds the question how to theorize the post-colonial and the multicultural when one realizes that one needs to avoid confirmations of binary oppositions between the colonizer and the colonized, white and black, those in power and those subjected to power. Homi Bhabha instead focuses attention on the unexpected and unintended new forms of subjectivity that emerge from interactions between different individuals and groups in a global multicultural context. For example, in a foreword written to a text edition of Frans Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Homi Bhabha seeks to move beyond Fanon's language of duality towards the more productive aspects in what Fanon calls himself his clinical studies into the psycho-existential complexes one finds in colonial and racial systems. It is in the psycho-affective realm that one can find the conditions for the performance of agency and for liberating acts. Bodies, dreams, repressions, imaginaries, and resistances all testify of this. In his subtle inquiries into these conditions, one recognizes the influence of Foucault on the distribution of power and knowledge in a network of actors, and his fascination for liminal figures, cynics, madmen, and hysterics that seemingly appear in the margins of institutions and systems, but actually reveal the cracks and the fissures at the heart of these power-knowledge systems. Derrida's thought on différance enables Homi Bhabha to see multiculturality not as a fusion, assimilation, or an erasure of cultural differences, but as a space in which signifiers have no fixed meaning, and in which identities are hybrid and contingent, mimicking and rejecting, repeating and deferring, repressing and acting out. Thinking beyond the binary is thinking beyond fixed stereotypical identities in a way familiar to Edward Said in his text Freud and the Non-European, a lecture he held at the London Freud Museum, and in which Said focuses attention on Freud's deconstruction of the Jewish character, showing that any doctrinal or ideological attempt to found identity on a sound foundational basis and in opposition to other identities will inevitably fail. Thinking beyond identity is thinking with psychoanalysis. In Homi Bhabha's writings, one regularly finds references to psychoanalysis when thinking through concepts of hybridization, ambivalence, mimicry, identification and signification, and the other as differentiating force. Through Lacan, Fanon, and others, there's a deep connection with Freud and his insight that a broken and fragmented crystal not only is an adequate metaphor to describe psychopathologies, but informs us also about the inherent instability of human psychic life. Is this instability not also the condition for production, for reinventing oneself, desiring another situation, questioning what is seemingly self-evident, making fluid what seems to be solid stone? To push this connection with Freud a little bit further, like for Freud, art can be seen as the materialization of psychic life and psychic change. In Homi Bhabha's texts on art and in his conversations with artists such as Anish Kapoor, William Kentridge or Dayanita Singh, one finds again this thinking beyond identities and binaries. In a conversation with Kapoor from 1993, it is a long time ago, Homi Bhabha speaks of his fascination for how the creation of a hole in a large craggy stone unsettles the spectator's self and creates movement towards new and other ways of conceiving oneself. Art creates a formative third space between previous seemingly rock-solid positions, a space for interaction and reinvention. It is more than just a far-fetched association to say that the cracks and holes in crystals and stones establish a bridge to tonight's lecture. Homi Bhabha's lecture is entitled On the Excessive Power of Affective Coloring, Trauma and the Deaf, Race and the Dance of Death, a lecture in which he will reflect on contemporary traumatizing effects of racial violence that appear in the cracks and the fissures of our societies and that shake our lives. We are all looking forward to your thoughts for our times.
Thank you. Monika and Herman, thank you very much for your wonderful words. Of course, Daniela, we've been conversing for a long time as we set this up initially, and then I was unable to come, and so you very generously postponed it. So for an unseasonal event, please blame me. But it's great to see you all here today. I think last night when we were walking around the museum in admiration for its severe conceptual draw on our interests as well as on our the process of thinking Freud through these spaces, much of which are empty, where there was the couch, now there is a wall kept empty, and I was particularly enchanted by that idea of keeping that wall empty. But while doing that, I noticed in one of the publications from the 20s, or the name Bose, B-O-S-E, which is a well-known Indian name. And that brought a story which I hope I brought to you and we can do something with it. That Bose was a Bengali intellectual who agitated for founding, as I believe, the first chair in psychoanalysis at the University of Calcutta. And what was so interesting was that Bose then, who had never seen a picture or photograph of Freud, made a sketch and said, "This is you, Mr. Freud," and sent it to Mr. Freud. Well, the sketch was a kind of something between a sort of an Italian roue and an English solar-topied colonial officer. And Freud apparently was horrified and said, who does this man think I am? And why did he send me this insulting photograph? Narcissism, as you know, has a long life. Anyway, I want to thank you all for having me here today. And of one thing I'm quite sure, that had it not been for the kindness and generosity of my friend Lisa Pignanesi and for our late partner, late John Forrester, I probably would have not been here, but I'm very glad to have been here. All right, thank you. So I thought I would just start reading a few verses from Auden's In Memory of Sigmund Freud, because I noticed in John's new book, posthumously published, there is a little reference to a phrase from the poem, which you know probably quite well. Freud is now a whole climate of opinion. So I thought I'd just read a few verses in tribute to John, a dear friend, a great bon viveur, and a very warm and loving person with whom we were very close for many years. So I might just read you a few verses in honor of John Forrester. No wonder the ancient cultures of conceit, in his technique of unsettlement, foresaw the fall of princes, the collapse of their lucrative patterns of frustration. If he succeeded, why? The generalized life would become impossible, the monolith of state be broken and prevented the cooperation of avengers. Of course they called on God, but he went his way, down among the lost people like Dante, down to the stinking fosse where the injured lead the ugly life of the rejected, and showed us what evil is, not as we thought, deeds that must be punished, but our lack of faith, our dishonest mood of denial, the concupiscence of the oppressor. If some traces of the autocratic pose, the paternal strictness he distrusted, still clung to his utterance and features, it was a protective coloration. For one who'd lived among enemies so long, if often he was wrong and at times absurd, to us he is no more a person now, but a whole climate of opinion. Thank you very much. John, you are with us. Lisa, you are in London, but you are still with us. Okay, let me start. I want to start with a passage that is very significant in my thinking of psychoanalysis and Freud, but also language. And it's written by Walter Benjamin, and it's a passage from the Arcades Project. In the dialectical image, what has been within a particular epoch is always simultaneously what has been from time immemorial. As such, however, it is manifest on each occasion only to a quite specific epoch, namely the one in which humanity, rubbing its eyes, recognizing just this particular dream image as such as it is at this moment that the historian takes up, with regard to that image, the task of dream interpretation. Since this is woven, or responses to this are woven right through the essay, but I have not been boringly self-referential in that case, but this I just wanted to give you as a kind of leitmotif. Like many of you, in those pandemic years, I was quarantined at home, fighting a faceless public enemy whose skin was as thin as the air itself. COVID-19 swirled in the breath of friends, hid in the handshakes of acquaintances, and flew furtively in the language of love. Fear turned me into a masked fugitive, running for safety before I ran out of luck. Fleeing from ordinary life, I fell into the ordinances of public health and the creative disorders of fear and fantasy. The revolving door between the public world and the private life, normally easing us from the one to the other, suddenly became dysfunctional. The exit to the street and to the entry to the home both led confusingly in the domestic direction. Taking flight from COVID results in an enlargement of the private. In Hannah Arendt's phrase, the public world is sucked into the domestic incubus with a surreal intensity. Flat screen monitors, wall-to-wall, Zoom, FaceTime, WhatsApp, Facebook, iPhone make the external world intimately visible, but with a loss of density and depth. Everything seems cropped and framed, weightless in the flicker of pixels, displaying the twilight of morbidity or mortality. Engorged in this enlargement of the private, I felt at times that I was living a half-life, and at other times that I was a double man. And indeed, my talk builds in a way on my attempt to try and think about the pandemic and George Floyd coming together as an intersection. I've tried to do this in many ways, but today, this time, I thought I saw the limits of what I was trying to do, but also some openings. So here am I, living a half-life and at other times a double man or a double person, just as many of us were when the pandemic started opening up, and very soon after, George Floyd was killed. How do you think the two things together? Much that happened in that extended COVID-19 moment seems somewhat blurred now, as were those days themselves, frequently referred to as Blur's Day in English, Hypertime in French, as one day looped into another, lundi dimanche. However, the afterlife of that strange time lives on in the anxious temporality of social abreaction and psychic translation. We have been plagued from time immemorial with plagues, but each manifestation on each specific traumatic occasion comes together in a flash with the now to form a constellation suddenly emergent, as Walter Benjamin would put it. If we don't rub our eyes in disbelief and look afresh when blinded by the flash of the now, dream or nightmare, we see nothing. Each Penelope who waits in transition or in translation for Odysseus, or her refugee husband, or her worn-torn child to return home, unweaves time immemorial into the temporality of a now suddenly emergent. Today, dear friends, I speak to you of the afterlives or afterwardnesses in the Freudian sense of the virulence of COVID and racial violence, death by illness, death by injustice, that formed a constellation in the dog days of May 2020, when Orion's dog, a harbinger of death and suffering for all mankind, as the Greeks believed, sniffed around our forecourts and our back alleys. As the city begins to come back to life, it is undone by death. On May the 25th, 2020, as public life warily opens up to the new normal, masked, distanced, sanitized, it is greeted by a scene of public murder. America and much of the world, on parole from the pandemic, stares at a singular death in the face. Neither in a house nor a chamber, but on a corner of 18th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, the public comes face to face with the curbside killing of George Floyd, crushed to death under the knee of police constable Derek Chauvin. A new normal? We ask ourselves watching Daniela Fraser's witness video. This is the young woman who was there, who videoed as much as she could, and whose video was part of a major public social media distribution across the world, but it was also used in the case itself. We ask ourselves, watching Daniela Fraser's video, is this a new normal? And nothing about this is new, a criminologist explains, referring to the 70 people, more than half of them black, who over the past decade exclaimed, "I can't breathe," before dying in police custody. In the early stages of COVID, a health worker reports patients are prone to foreboding of death, and they're rarely wrong, that death is coming no matter what they do. In the early stages of his arrest, Floyd had a similar presentiment. "Tell my kids I love them. I am dead." As Floyd is held face down on the sidewalk at the intersection, on that very day, in that very place, turn your eyes to face a very different kind of death. In a hospital not far from the site of Floyd's torture, or it could be a hospital near you or me, a critical care nurse prones her patients, lays them face down to help oxygenate lungs that feel as if they're on fire, ceaselessly stung by bees. She observes their faces minutely during her 16-hour shift to see whether they have developed face ulcers or corneal abrasions. "Could we put their heads in a donut?" she asks, "like you see on a massage table? Could we turn their heads and protect their skin with special material?" Exhausted, eventually, as good a death as possible, at 2 a.m. in the intensive care unit. In the midst of this montage I'm constructing for you between a caring death and a killing death, think now of Floyd, also proned, turned face down with Officer Chauvin's 100-pound knee deoxygenating his lungs. "Last time I got shot like that, Mr. Officer, it was the same thing. It was the same way before. Please, if I'll look you eye to eye, man, please don't shoot me." Again and again, the pleas that he should not be shot. Again and again, the question, "Why are you twitching?" "Sir, I have an anxiety disorder." "Doctor, I can prove it to you." "Shut up. You seem to have a lot of air in your lungs." Floyd's pleas for bare life remain unheard. 3 minutes and 51 seconds later, he is non-responsive. In the same city, 2 breathless people lying face down saying, "I can't breathe." A good death in the hospital at 2 a.m. A bad death on the street at 8:25 p.m. And my attempt to put these together in a kind of a montage, or an early version of that, is to try and touch on the details of the 2 bodily postures, proning for life, proning for death. Those were the kind of details I was trying to pull together, this is a shorter version, in this attempt, in this intersective attempt, in this articulated attempt of speaking as these two events. Of course, this kind of montage is precisely the sort of thing that Benjamin says is a kind of a method which is not historicist. He said the problem with a lot of Marxist criticism, Marxist historicism, is that it is always progressive and teleological, whereas in fact it's in the details, as you see in the Arcades Project, of things coming together in a wobbly and shaky and yet a constellated, of course is his word, a constellated way. And much of this paper is about forms of constellation, experiments of certain kinds of writing. In real time after George Floyd's killing, the public imaginary was captured by the racial analogy between disproportionate pandemic deaths and disproportionate police killings of black and minority groups. As of a March 2024 report, between 2020 and 2023, Native Americans, blacks, and Hispanics were roughly between 1.5 and 2 times more likely to die from COVID. And according to the Pew Research Center, almost the same proportion of black Americans and Latinx people were likely to be shot and killed by the police. The Center for Disease Control did not reveal these statistics until they were sued by the New York Times, after which they did. But this is not only, of course, an American story, and this is not the only thing that I want to actually try and get at in this connective narrative. But I felt I really had to say this because it is still so striking that the latest statistics, which were collected in 2024, still show this huge disparity in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. But you know, the American scene is not the only one. The same kind of story occurs on a global scale, whether you're talking about Muslims and untouchables in India, whether you're talking about Kurds in Turkey, and on and on. In some way now, in every election, in every country, the minority, the refugee or the migrant is precisely the neuralgic point of anxiety, of a sense of injustice, of a sense of an instinct of death. That is the death in life, which Levinas talks about, the metaphor of death life. This, in my view, although one should never be so emphatic about any subtle philosophical idea, I do believe that the metaphoricity of death life is focused now wherever you go. And indeed, minorities paid the largest price for pandemic misgovernance and state violence. And of course, you hear the voices, make my nation white again, make my people Hindu again, make America great again. The traditional tendency is to associate the adjective great with the populist expansionism and chauvinism. But for me, far more lethal is the temporal, rebarbative atavism of the word again. If great calls forth a majoritarian hegemony, as you hear, the accompanying adverb again, its repetition, is a revanchist temporality of degradation that authorizes a mythical return to a state of racial exclusivity and cultural purity. The adverb, again, as an affective appeal to barbaric nationalism, can be read as a version of the Freudian screen memory writ large across the populist patriotic unconscious. I'm always a little bit chary of the notion of the political unconscious, but I think when you can actually see both the language and construction, the psychic construction, in a particular time, in a particular discourse, that's when you try and point it out. Simple inaccuracy of recollection does not play any considerable part here, Freud explains. Close investigations show rather these falsifications of memory are tendentious. That is, they serve the purpose of repression and replacement and a number of other motives, with no question for historical accuracy. I would now add, as I shall say, that the most virulent forms of racial anxiety and aggressivity, because the racist is also anxious. It is not only that the victim is anxious, but I think disavowal, which Freud does not mention, in my view, is as important a kind of affective self-negation momentarily. So disavowal, to me, is the concept I think missing in the screen memory, in the early screen memory descriptions. But then, of course, Freud was writing at a different time. Now, in Society Must Be Defended, Foucault argues that the first function of racism is to fragment, to create caesuras within the biological continuum addressed by biopower. This, of course, is also very interesting because, in a way, the ontology of racist desire comes not from some face-to-face aggressivity. It spurts up in fragments to create caesuras, to break this sense, even humanist sense of a biological continuum. Collective practices of racial repression and replacement without historical accuracy amounts to more than racial discrimination, in my belief. It generates the racial power of what I've been recently developing as demographic dissolution. Fanon, for instance, not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to the white man. He has been given two frames of reference. His customs and sources were wiped out because they were in conflict with a civilization that he did not know and that imposed itself on him. The demographic dissolution of the other hollows out the lifeless sites of biopolitical caesuras that destroy the biological and human continuum. The two frames of reference that Fanon mentions signify, I believe, a double projection. First, the racialized object, or indeed part object, is fragmented and fixed in an ontological fantasy of arrested development that is regressive. Then the racialized subject, or the fetish, the racialized fetish, on the other hand, is treated as an anxiogenic production of aggressivity. So it goes in both ways. On the one hand, it's arrested development, it's not. On the other, the racialized subject becomes a traumatic source of inchoate fears of being the barbarian standing at the white gates of the civilized citadel. A situation at once arrested and arresting. A racial scenario as common as the anti-migrant discourse at any port of entry or border post to this day, and indeed writ in large in most rhetorics of ethno-nationalism, whether it's in the global south or the global north. Demographic dissolution, the term I'm working with, exercises its power by disavowing its own violent psychic drives and discharging the anxious political energies by way of what Laplanche and Pontalis called disowning projections. As they say, the racist, for instance, projects his own false and unacknowledged inclinations on the group he reviles. Unacknowledged inclinations on the group he reviles. Disavowal, or the unacknowledged inclinations, not repressions. That's the disavowal issue. Not repressions, but the unacknowledged inclinations, so of which he is half aware. I know, but so what, in the formulation, linguistic formulation of disavowal, enables the ambivalence then that intensifies the banality of evil. So when people talk about exclusion, as if, racialized people are just like excluded and then the national story goes on with its life, I think we have to see the complexity of the ambivalence, and the ambivalence in disavowal in particular. And there is nothing as charged with violence as a disavowed ambivalence. A repression, in a sense, I would like to argue amongst all these specialists. I'm a Freudian hacker. I use it where I need to. But it seems to me that this idea of a repressive projection is much less interesting than a projection based on the ambivalence of disavowal. Fanon again. The European knows and he does not know. On the level of reflection, a Negro is a Negro. But in the unconscious, there is the firmly fixed image of the Negro savage. The European racist or the racist knows and he does not know. Of course, Fanon talks about Europeans, talks about white racism, because indeed that's what he is dealing with at his time. You see, the lights of Europe dim. And I have to say that there was another version of what I was going to do, which was much more focused on Fanon. And I think that Fanonian theory needs to, psychoanalytic theory needs to be further developed. There are developments too, rather than what we now have, which are long, very well done journalistic biographies of Fanon, which are fascinating. But I think the work still needs to be done, and I try and do a little bit of it whenever I can. So much, my friends, for real-time reflections and life-death fantasies in May 2020. My interest in the tryst of epidemiology and criminology, the dying breath in the hospital, and the death by breathlessness on the street in Minneapolis is more allegorical than the analogical accounts of the time and that still continue. And the medium of my mediation is the role of traumatic time. Sudden, short, displaced, obscure, unstable, as it provides a critical matrix for signifying events for which we are ethically and affectively unprepared, although our lives are lived in a kind of anticipation of their happening, or if not of their happening, better still their happenstance, the risk or chance that they could very well happen. To put it another way, I'm interested in the event of the present moment, or the present moment as an event. My interest is not at all presentist in the brilliant manner exposed by François Hartog's critique in Regimes of Historicity, where he argues that presentist time is growing increasingly individual. My time is not yours, and it is not someone else's either. I learned my lesson about the sudden moment of a traumatic blindness in the midst of the pandemic crisis, a blindness of history, a blindness of language, a blindness of the condition itself. And that's where I started thinking that my interest was in trying to produce a kind of what Foucault would call ontology of the present moment. And let me say that the present moment that I focus on is not the moment. It is like any other critical perspective. It is the setting of a frame. So it's not just to say the moment is not the year. Of course, the moment is not the year. The moment is not the month or the decade. So I'm just interested in seeing the way in which language and enunciation and historical events fall through, pass through this lens that I put there of the moment. So, this interest of the blindness in the midst of the pandemic moment is an idea that was generated for me by Lorraine Daston, the historian of science in the early days of the pandemic. I, like many others, anxiously ferreted in the archives of pandemics, literary and epidemiological. I've never seen more people who wrote about the plague, because we had to be reminded of Camus, which is a wonderful thing to be reminded of, but it didn't for me push anything that far about the panic of that moment, to the hysteria, the anxiety in our bodies of knowledge. So I anxiously ferreted in the archives of pandemics, literary and epidemiological and philosophical, trying to adjust to the situation in which we were in. It was Daston who convinced me that I was not a ferret, I was a quaking cuttlefish. Now, cuttlefish, does everybody know what a cuttlefish is? A sepia or yeah, because this is a little bit important for the next two sentences. Yet, in moments of radical novelty, writes Lorraine Daston, for whom I have the greatest affection and respect, Moments of radical novelty and the radical uncertainty novelty emits, very close to what I was talking about, the unpreparedness for which you are unprepared, but you know in anticipation that it will happen. So radical novelty and radical uncertain novelty emits, she writes, like a squid obscuring itself in ink. We are temporarily thrown back in time, catapulting to the 17th century. We're also living as we live in a moment of ground zero empiricism in which almost everything is up for grabs. Chance observations, apparent correlations, and anecdotes that would barely merit mention have the interest buzzing with speculations amongst physicians, lay public, virologists, and epidemiologists. And I was very taken, and I am taken with this. She doesn't read it psychoanalytically at all. I do, with this notion of a 0 degree, the 0 degree of empiricism. And of course, what happens in the 0 degree of empiricism, as I should explain, is that the norms, the empirical norms and methods, are now overwhelmed with all the materials that it is supposed to frame. It's almost as if the symptoms of a wild empiricism now comes and hides the sign of the empirical, the normative sign of the empirical. A state of ground zero empiricism is a phrase scribbled all over my early dog day diaries, in a Freudian way of anticipating anxiety, expecting, as he says, danger or preparing for it, even though its source is unknown and its course unclear. Yes, everything seemed to be up for grabs, including empiricism itself. Being thrown back into a moment of ground zero empiricism is a discursive trauma of afterwardsness or Freudian deferred action. The epistemic norm loses what might be described as its efficacious barrier against external stimuli. Again, I'm talking about the traumatic condition in Freud, to the extent that at ground zero, in the order of empirical reasoning is overwhelmed by a chaos of the overstimulation of stray elements of observation where anything goes. Medical speculation and chance observation collide or collude with personal anecdotes, while virologists quarrel with epidemiologists like squid obscuring themselves in ink. It is as if the body of empirical observation, critical to medical cure and public health decisions, has itself become wildly symptomatic. Now, the negative sign of empiricism is waiting to be restored or retranslated. And of course, what I'm doing is a certain kind of psychoanalysis of discourse. This is not about individual psychoanalytic reactions. It's not about Lorraine Daston talking about her own lostness in 0 degree empiricism, but this is the kind of psychoanalytic work, given that it is the linguistic cure and teaches us to endure language more than almost any other discourse, say, than poetry, maybe art. I begin to think about this importance of thinking about these moments in discourse which themselves become psychoaffective. Empiricism degree 0 is accompanied, I believe, now this is me just doing a bit of riffing, by a disorder in writing degree 0. Language is a skin. You remember Roland Barthes writes in that book, I rub my language against the other. The self is roused to linguistic life by the touch of the signifier's skin, carried out on a blast or two during the pandemic of viral bad breath, to realize its meaning by rubbing against the alterity of the other's discourse. But in the babel of empirical hysteria, language becomes an obscure, overdetermined sign of pandemic panic. Fully masked and standing at a distance of 6 feet apart, nothing could be effectively rubbed against anything else, or indeed anybody else. As Freud once rightly observed about traumatic narration, that a group of provoking causes have been able to exercise a traumatic effect by summation, and they belong together insofar as they are part components of a single story of suffering, which is why I talk about zero-degree empiricism and at a kind of non-epistemic level, then zero-degree language, to think about the kind of isolation, in a way, and the of those pandemic moments, the kind of the protection of against the breakdown of the defense stimuli. Staring in the face of a single story of suffering, to repeat Freud's phrase, the traumatic story of the murder of George Floyd unfolding on television on May 25th, and you can see now I'm moving from the pandemic and George Floyd to George Floyd and the pandemic. This is a continual movement of the paper. I needed a whiskey and a friend watching television, and I turned, of course, like most others, to Camus' La Peste, in search of Dr. Rieu, physician and metaphysician, is both, for whom pandemic confinement is a moral metaphor for confinement and carcerality, repression, disavowal, and dehumanization. You can see it written right through the book. And the notion of the present becomes even more important, and I've written about this elsewhere, because we don't know that the book is being written by him in that present as we are reading it in ours. We only find out at the end of the book that he's in fact the writer. My mind turned from the pandemic, like millions on that day, May 25th, 2020, to the 8.57 minutes on a curbside in Minneapolis, where a black man's lungs were bust like a threadbare tire of a heavy vehicle bursting under pressure. The voiceover in my mind that kept playing alongside the news reports was a memorable line from one of Justice Sotomayor's dissenting opinions in the US Supreme Court, to which I will return. This case tells, this is not about George Floyd, but it's about a stop and search. This case tells everyone, white and black, guilty and innocent, that an officer can verify your legal status at any time. It implies that you are not a citizen of a democracy, but the subject of a carceral state just waiting to be catalogued. Forgive me for straying, and let me return to my tepid whiskey and my friend Ria's observation on confinement and carcerality. For the confined, Camus writes, there was always something missing or lacking in their lives, hostile to the past, impatient of the present, and cheated of the future. We were much like those men and women where injustice and hatred forces them to live behind bars. Richard hesitated, then fixed his eyes on Rieu. Please answer me quite frankly, are you absolutely convinced it's plague? You're stating the problem wrongly. Rieu retorts, it's not a question of the term I use. It's a question of time. So from the pandemic time and the pandemic moment now to the George Floyd and the African American notion of the moment. The robbery of time, measured not in lifespans, but in moments, is the defining feature of being drafted into the black race, says the renowned African American writer Ta-Nehisi Coates. It was that phrase that had circulated within me problematically and anxiously through the pandemic, when one thought that life could be turned in a minute or in moments to 8.57 with Floyd. It was at that phrase, not lifespans, but moments, playing off against Floyd's 8.57 minutes of I can't breathe, that goaded my desire to develop a concept of traumatic racism as a significant yet distinct moment in the annals of systemic racism. Here is an unknown man in Minneapolis, murdered. It was a second degree murder, manslaughter, murdered on a street. And almost everywhere, from the United States through Europe and India, you had people painting murals of George Floyd. And I could not believe that this outpouring of a certain anxious identification could be understood as institutional or systemic racism, which became the progressive flag under which cases like George Floyd would over time be investigated and archived. Seemed to me that there was something in the vividness, even in the performance, in the affective performance of agony in Fanon, Du Bois, Baldwin, and many others, that there was something to be said about a different phenomenological and also aesthetic problematic notion of racial attacks. And this was not the same, it did not relate to the same conscious or unconscious or mythopoeic imagination of systemic racism. And this has become a central part of the book that I'm just completing. Almost 100 years earlier than Ta-Nehisi Coates saying the robbery of time in lifespans, the robbery of time is the entry to the African American world, and several decades earlier than Camus, Rio saying confinement that happens in these small moments of time have to be attended to. You will remember that in the plague, it's not so much the cure, but the rightly and medical notion and philosophical notion of attention to what is going on moment by moment. So when people said, will she die? Rio always says, I'm waiting to see. This attention becomes a very important measure of time. So I then discovered really that Du Bois had a passage which has barely been really talked about, which I think is one of the most interesting ways of reading Du Bois, which is not in terms of of course, historically, or his sociology is remarkable, but I was interested in this particular way in which he talked about race, time, and the identificatory object. So Du Bois, the master builder of modern African-American double consciousness, had written of the affective temporality of black exigent life, but the interest of people who write about Du Bois is not in this aspect for good reasons. So here is Du Bois' statement. My pale friend looks at me with disbelief and curling tongue, Du Bois writes, when I talk about my everyday experiences with the anxiety of racial exclusion and insult. I paraphrase this a little bit to cut the quote. Do you mean to sit there and tell me that this is what happens to you each day? His pale friend asks with a touch of irony and disingenuity. At that moment, Du Bois shoots back with a brilliant answer. Not all each day, surely not, but now and then, now seldom, now sudden, now after a week, now in a chain of awful minutes. Not everywhere, but anywhere. In Boston, in Atlanta. That's the hell of it. The chain of awful minutes. Again, not knowing when they will come, but that they will come. Suddenly for me, the spatial divisions of segregation, so common to the notion of systemic racism, neighborhoods, specifically over police neighborhoods or whatever, the notion of the spatial seem to now translate into the iterative and interrupted duration of temporal discrimination. Time is the trauma of racial indignity and bodily injury. In a chain of awful minutes, not everywhere but anywhere, has become the motif of some of my work. The temporal economy of traumatic neurosis is, according to Freud, associated with accidents, with warlike circumstances, and is distinct from pathological trauma. It is, and I quote, an experience which within a short period of time presents the mind with an increase of stimulus too powerful to be dealt with or worked out in the normal way, and this must result in a permanent disturbance of the manner in which energy operates. It is as though these patients had not finished with the traumatic situation, as they were still faced with it as an immediate task which had not been dealt with, and in the Benjaminian sense, that the actual, you re-inhabit the trauma as of now. And that nowness, which does not say that there isn't a past, but it says that there is a translation, not a transmission of time, but a translation of time as the now, that began to seem to me something that the kind of moral virtues, and I have nothing against moral virtues of systemic racism, never really dealt with. The nowness of the attack. The temporal markers of the traumatic moment are short and sudden periods of time, overwhelmed by the affective coloring, as Freud puts it, of the anxious risks of everyday racial living. Not everywhere, but anywhere. That's the hell of it. As Elizabeth Alexander, author of The Trayvon Generation, describes it, this one was shot, that one was shot, this one danced like a marionette as he was shot down in Chicago. 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a knee and full weight on his neck. I can't breathe, and then, Mama, Mama, George Floyd cried. I could dramatize exactly these moments in Fanon too. And the attempt is always to be reductive in a way of the affective and the poetic, and to file it under the systemic and the and policy data. But I am not saying that the systemic does not have its place. Please don't misunderstand me. But I'm saying there's a huge part of this traumatic temporal, not geographical based notion of race. And you know, I asked a colleague of mine in the law school, if you thought about the police and police procedure in terms of tropes, what is the most important trope? And they said space. Space, you know, where do people live? Why is X who lives, this black person or that Indian person or that it doesn't usually come around in these parts? Why is he or she here? This notion of the crossing or the transgressing of space has become so important. So I'm trying to, in my own way, shift to thinking really about the temporality of these moments and what they mean, and why it was 8.46 minutes of an unknown person that created a vast outpouring of affective anxiety and identification. I don't want to say, I find the word empathy too lacking in tension. Why in different social circumstances, different political circumstances, and very important to this, let's not forget, was the visual representation. The repeated portraits. I saw portraits from Syria about George Floyd. Didn't look very much like George Floyd. I saw portraits in walls in New Delhi, or walls in the south of India, or of course there was a big mural in Berlin. Each what people would call in the digital world remediation, and I like that digital notion of each remediation was a translation of that moment. And it was a translation because there was a distortion as well as a kind of descriptive element. I really know something about the way in which these significations work. The political struggle against structural racism is crucial to the creation of a just and equitable society. Statistical, data-driven knowledge is an essential aid in formulating reform strategies and evaluating their success. And statistical data, don't get me wrong, is relevant whether we seek equity in the classroom, justice in the courtroom, or equal representation in the council chamber. However, policy-driven rationality or rational choice theory, which is what most of the statistical institutional critiques do, is fundamentally consequentialist and driven by rationalist choice. It is dubious of the validity of choices and judgments made in the pressure of real-time risk in the heat of the moment. For these very reasons, the long arc of structural racism, in my view, must be supplemented and interrogated by the vicissitudes of vividness in art, in literature, in cinema, in film, in psychic investigations, at once affective and narrative, as it shapes the imminent experience of the traumatic act. Traumatic racism finds its most telling representation in the urgency of the arts. Image, language, paint, movement, those very forms of life and language that depend on the vividness of phenomenological and semiological performance. And don't forget, if you read the material on what they now call statistical lives, Harvard, Chicago in the law school are quite important areas, but also in economics departments. I read the kind of primers of the statistical lives literature, and the interesting thing there was that people were told, if you want to actually do this kind of statistical work, then there has to be no identification with the problem. But there must not be the vividness of narrative in presenting the problem either. Like psychic trauma, poetic vividness provides an experience. I talk about the poetic, I mean more general in the arts, provides an experience whose affective coloring, Freud's phrase, this is Freud's phrase, is excessively powerful. The fixity of racial trauma transplants a subject into an intermediate present, I suggest, as in the suspended time of any performance or the lost moments of cinema. Claudia Rankine's litany, that I'm going to read a short part of you, represents the names of Black lives lost, but each repetition projects the listener into a futurity for which he or she is unprepared. The affective coloring is less powerfully invoked by Black names than by the blank gaps in between the lines, the biopolitics of fragments and caesuras, and the foreshortening of verses. Claudia Rankine. In memory of Philando Castile. In memory of Jordan Edwards. In memory of Stephen Clark. In memory of Breonna Taylor. In memory of George Floyd. In memory. In memory. In memory. Racial profiling is just what it says it is. A profile of a body, a silhouette, an outline of another, emptied of its ontological presence, not a politics of identity. The strongest anti-racist work is ontological, which is why even somebody like Fanon can say, we cannot take the next step on our own. We have to take it with those with whom we have our disputes. So it's an ontological problem. It's a problem of starting a new way of thinking, being in time in which there can be various contributors. But unfortunately, this whole politics of identity and identitarianism on both the right and the left, on both white and black, has actually destroyed this argument that the greatest critiques of racism and the most moving forms of the reconstruction are based on an ontological issue, not a politics of identity. Profiling goes beyond prejudice or discrimination in conditions of what I call demographic dissolution. The outline of the black body or the figure that is minoritarian caught in the headlights of a car or the surveillance camera of the law and order system. As I end, I'm excerpting a few lines from Justice Sotomayor's judgment on the police practice of what a stop and search are called Terry stops. And this comes and from a dissenting opinion of the Supreme Court, the case Utah versus Strieff in June 2016. It is illustrative of much that I have proposed. The traumatic 0-degree demographic dissolution, a life of agonizing minutes or moments, and undeserved death in 8.46 minutes. So it kind of summarizes much that I've tried to say in my own voice, in the voice of Fanon, and in many other echoes throughout this paper. I'm accepting these few lines, which consist in temporarily detaining someone suspected of illegal activity, perfectly banal in France, but controversial in the United States. A judgment that she turns into a vivid ontological account of police harms and public humiliations. It's not an identitarian identity issue. As the black body is broken down by her for the purposes of evidence and examination, Sotomayor's narrative breaks down the police actions into precisely these temporal moments of the present. You know what Benveniste once called the présent maintenant. And again, it's an artifice. It's not some naturalized moment of truth, but it's this présent maintenant that keeps repeating. She says, first you are told that you look like a criminal because there is only one guy who's fitting the description. Then your dignity is soiled by your bodily privacy. After that time comes the curbside spectacle of public shaming. And finally, the stripping of your rights as a citizen. Sotomayor's judgment in the practical procedures of criminal justice are turned into narratives of compelling extrajudicial affective colorings that this moment, the traumatic neurosis of the traumatic anxiety of racism picks up, and the statistical account leaves out of account. Sotomayor, the indignity of the stop is not limited to an officer telling you that you look like a criminal. He may then frisk you for weapons. That involves just more than a pat down. And as onlookers pass by, the officer may feel with sensitive fingers, this is a quote from the case, every portion of your body. A thorough search may be made of your arms and armpits, waistline and back, the groin and area about the testicles, if you're a man, an entire surface of the legs down to the groin and the feet. Even if you are innocent, you will now join the 65 million Americans with an arrest record and experience the civil death of discrimination by employers, landlords, and whoever else conducts a background check. By legitimizing the conduct that produces this double consciousness, this case tells everyone, white and black, guilty and innocent, I've quoted this earlier, that an officer can verify your legal status at any time. It says that your body is subject to invasion while courts excuse the violation of your rights. It implies that you are not a citizen of a democracy, but the subject of a carceral state just waiting to be catalogued. I dissent. Freedom is a principle, Hannah Arendt argues, that lies in action. in the performance of the act itself, in this présent maintenant, in distinction from its goal. Freedom is about the time of movement, the time of the ability of being able to move, finding the right time. Politics, as we say, is all about timing. But I believe that the intimate temporal relation between action and freedom, or freedom as action, is an entangled affective process and procedure that works through the interregnum of the loss of freedom to institute a new beginning. I hold on to disappointed hope in the manner of Ernest Bloch's belief that hope will be disappointed because it does not aspire to a simple-minded fulfillment in the future. Hope, in my view, is proleptic. It is an anticipatory aspiration beckoning to a future that is only virtual as yet to come, and yet vital to the ways in which we shape our present moment and conduct ourselves ethically, politically, and aesthetically in relation to the precocious passage of a living history. Disappointed hope is open in a forward direction, writes Bloch. For this reason, hope, while actually in a state of suspension, as he puts it, each of those moments that I presented, states of suspension, is committed to change rather than repetition. And what is more, incorporates the element of chance and risk. James Baldwin, those who have lost the most must take the largest risk, because without it, there could be nothing new. You have given me hope by listening. I hope I have not disappointed you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let me first pour you some water.
Thank you. Herman. That's very sweet of you. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Homi, for such an impressive lecture. You've taken us not in a roller coaster ride, but through a lot of quotations and a lot of authors, Fanon, Camus, Foucault, a bit of Freud hacking, but of course that's allowed to hack Freud and to hack into Freud. Thank you so much. At a certain moment, you mentioned the term allegories of defining moments. I thought that's a lovely expression in bringing together these moments: the COVID pandemic, the murder, the killing of George Floyd, defining moments, good deaths, bad deaths, bringing them together in one allegory. There's of course, now I'm turning to the audience for a moment. There are some minutes left for Q&A. I will take the privilege, as I have it, to ask you to reflect maybe a bit more, if I may, on these final sentences on freedom and hope, and how to think that freedom and hope, from what you were saying before, the anxiety, the repetition of defining moments, this being caught in the circle of the again and the again. How to think that hope and that freedom in relation to that? Is it an opposition? Or is it maybe also founded in the same ground zero that you were talking about?
Thank you, Herman. I'm most grateful to you. In fact, the gesture right throughout was to keep that ground zero, alive as the sort of palpable, pulsating, traumatic moment around which other things can be done. Of course, there is anxiety, there is suffering, but there are also ways. Think of Freud's second theory of anxiety, where he talks about mitigation. the anxiety is both alarming, but it is also a mitigation. It's also a kind of defense. And of course, but that process doesn't stop. You don't get inured to the mitigation. That's why this notion of the moment, the moment présent, the présent maintenant, that I'm very interested in. That's why it happens, it happens again, but it happens differently again. And of course, there are words, we have clinical words or linguistic terms to describe these continuities. But what we have to really think is that when it begins again, it starts from a new place, even though in the afterwards, there's the recollection of the earlier place. And this, I just want to say, one of the things I find most compelling about Freud, about psychoanalytic thinking generally, but Freud in particular, that, he was very focused on the big questions and problems, totem and taboo, civilizations, discontents, the death drive, these big, big issues that have got a long history in other literatures, in religion and what. So somebody asked me, are you a universalist the other day in Bonn? But so what do you believe? Isn't there a kind of universalism? And I said, the only universalism that the only reason why I think that some of these big questions are adopted as a kind of a priori, almost transcendental universalism, which I'm opposed to, is that things that are universal are things that repeat. And each time they repeat, they carry an enigma with them. And that enigmatic moment is constructed from when they are enunciated. The enunciation of a truth, and here's the Foucauldian, that the semantic enunciation is not the same as the moment of enunciation. So every time you say, somebody says, but aren't life and death great universals? I think you might only see it in that way after you're dead from wherever you are, then maybe you see universal. But these questions are so important, read psychoanalytically, because they always make you begin again. Universalism is the unanswered question, the enigmatic question. So and that's why, I tried to give both my own views, obviously, and my own theoretical views, but I did want to bring in these voices to show that, this is not just some egoistic performance, that if you pull Du Bois into this moment of time, then it's a very different Du Bois than if you think about the transformation of the Black community, Black society, Black education. If you pull Foucault in this direction of what I call demographic dissolution, then you get a different reading of those chapters, on race, which I think are very brilliant in Society Must Be Defended. That's why I bring in strategically these voices, and to some extent I take them over. And that may be a problem.
I don't know. Some questions from the audience, and please keep your questions short if possible. In the back. Yes.
I have a very first question from our friend and member of our advisory board, Lisa Apianesi, who was watching the lecture from London. She writes, "Thank you, Homi, for a wonderfully stimulating lecture. Is there any art or artists you could point us toward who deal with this kind of trauma, this excessive power of affective coloring?"
Well, I certainly think, at least because it's close to my mind at the moment, I think this is true of William Kentridge. That's why this conversation between him and me has gone on for a while, till very recently also in the south of France with his new project. I also think of certain Indian artists who work on this on this kind of limit that I'm interested in. Vivan Sundaram was one of them. I also think I mean, you want me to give a list of names, or is that enough? I mean, I can. I also think of Matthew Barney, who really interests me from this perspective. Unfortunately, my vocabulary is so. Oh, Bruegel, and I have my friend Joseph Kerner here, who is the great diagnostician of Bruegel. But Bruegel, without knowing much about him, also challenges me. It's no surprise that I have taught a lot about that moment where you see those in the Bruegel in the Icarus painting, where you see those two tiny legs, that little moment that you could miss, including, of course, Icarus, his father, who's also in the bush, in the back, and you can hardly see that, at least in the reproductions. I could go on, but these are some names that come to mind. There was also sort of very early, not now so much, but an earlier period in Anish Kapoor's work where where light was very striated through the stone, and you could see it in this kind of flash on, flash off. This Benjamin thing, the flash coming in and out, and that doesn't mean simply that the beauty is in its oscillation. The beauty is in what each flash, illuminates or doesn't illuminate. So, Lisa, I'm delighted that you were listening in, and we will talk later tonight. But thank you very much. Let's give Lisa a hand.
Thank you very much. It was very enlightening, and I will think about this talk for days to come. Maybe I have also a I can recommend an artist, John Comfra, who has made 5 memorations also concerning this the montage of George Floyd and the pandemic. But
let me just say that, yeah, I've worked with John. He's a very good and old friend. But when you're asked, yes. First of all, I hate listing people, but when you're asked, but John is somebody, and Isaac Julian too, I would say, is an artist who has worked in this area.
My question concerns the time, but also the scene. And I thought about maybe the racialized trauma of the witness in the case of George Floyd, being a witness like the nurse or bystanders trying to somehow get to the scene and do anything to resolve the violence, but not being able to, because maybe also because of systemic racialized violence. Have you thought about the scene of the murder?
That's very interesting. Increasingly, I think, let me take a little, whatever, you have these Vienna circles. Let me take the widest circle, and then I'll come back. But I do think that in a sense, given the problems we have now of various kinds of inequalities, injustice, that the scene is more between, it's not the state and the family, or the state and it's the state and the street. I think that's a huge tension, and that's one of the reasons I actually quite like De Chirico, and have thought about him quite a bit. But it's the notion of the state and the street is often where the tension lies. And if you think about political movements, which now have much more my fealty, I may criticize them, but I feel closer to political movements than I feel to any political party now. That's where my politics, so no wonder my politics goes boom and bust all the time, because movements often lose that energy, but movements, and I do think that therefore the scene and the street is very important. There's a part of the longer version of this, which I might, with your permission, just mention, and it's not about witnessing in the way in which you mean it. And I think what you mean is a very humane notion that people want to intervene very often and are unable to do it because there's a cordon, a police cordon around it, or there are people protecting the scene. And I understand that. I think that is part of of a systemic imagination of dealing with violence, but I can also see why you need something like that. I don't think I can see that. But in terms of witnessing, it's really very important to think about the witness, and there's been a lot written about the witness. And some of it is, in my view, senselessly critical of witnessing, because they're often witnesses are also advocates for those who are not able to advocate for themselves. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, given the accessibility that people have to power, to language, and to words. But I made a proposal here, which I'm very committed to, where I say, it starts off with a kind of mimesis of this 8.46 minutes. It's very interesting that people had these murals on the walls everywhere. Then people used to dance. There are several dance companies dance for 8.46 minutes using time, and the shortness of time is the material. There were people who would sing on the monthly anniversary, on the date, and sing for 8.46 minutes. So then I thought, there is something about the haptic nature of the iPhone. Not only does it not perpetually in some way both enable us and distract us. The anxiety of the iPhone is incredible, I would say. And the projection on the iPhone is also incredible. So I was thinking, Diana Fraser shoots at whatever it is, 30 seconds. I think she shoots this video of the Floyd trial, which has now been in the public imagination, cropped to that 8.57 or 9 minutes. So I was thinking, there is a way in which if I see that video, 8.57 minutes now, at 10 to 9, if I take that 8.57 minutes, it occupies two temporalities. It occupies the temporality of whatever it would be in 8.57 minutes here. But that 8.57 minutes is also a second skin of time. It's also a way in which that scene becomes part of a moving memorial. And by that, I mean, I think what is so important is not simply the content of the scene, but taking that time or giving yourself over to that time. That 8.57 minutes now has a different temporal position than the time on your watch or the time that you can measure. It's another kind of time of bringing back. It's a kind of afterwardsness that happens. And the importance of that is not the content, but dedicating yourself, saying, this 8.57 minutes, whatever you think during that time, it's a sort of a second skin time. Now, even as I say it again to you, I feel that I need to work on this a lot more if it's going to have any particular purchase. But the importance is, when I hold that in my hand, it's an extension, it's a kind of bodily haptic relation to an object that you identify with, but is also, there's ambivalence, there's anxiety involved in that object itself, and it's a representational apparatus. That's just a stray thought I've had about another kind of witnessing, which is not, in a sense, being there, but not being there, or being not there.
One more question? No? Yes? One.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for your lecture and, well, more than a lecture. I'd like to make a very simple point that as an economist, I find economic theorist and empiricist, I find missing in almost all the discussions about identity, collective identity, and so on. In empirical work of international economics, economists deal with the entity of countries constituted by nations still. And they have a very trivial definition of a country, namely a multitude of individuals that have a common taste, that share a taste for public goods, for collective goods. And I think it sounds very trivial, but there's a lot in it, because if one tries to think a little from the point of view of public economics, there is a very, how should I say, quite compelling reason for why collective identities form. If we start from a Hobbesian point of view, or an existentialist point of view of human nature, it's the fundamental insecurity that we are thrown into with our existence. So from the first moment, we have to solicit cooperation. And in order to have a kind of yardstick for soliciting, sorry, my English is rusty, but I try. We have to have this kind of, how should I say, properties of the individuals we count within a collective identity. And so yeah, it will come. Sorry, I have to walk some way. So there are certain characteristics of human individuals that we take to be useful for forming a collective identity for the sake of cooperation. And here I am with the question: why do cultural theorists not use this instrument of economic theorizing in order to, in the first instance, understand what collective identities are, why they have been forming throughout human existence, and why they still are with us? Is there some reason that the divide, and that's the end of what I want? Is there some reason that the divide between cultural theory and how should I say, mathematically founded economic theory and empiricism is so strong that we don't look across the border? Sorry.
Thank you very much. I think that was more of a comment. It was a large encyclopedic kind of concern or inquiry. And you know, there are cultural theorists who actually focus very much on particular public services, for instance. And they're as interested in the symbolic relations that these have to the societies in which they are, but also to the economy in a more institutional sense. Most often when I read, and this is possibly the narrowness of my experience, but when I read critical theorists taking on mathematical economic arguments, I'm sure largely due to my own ignorance, I have not found that to be illuminating. However, there are many art historians, there are many critics of book theory, for instance, who are very interested in the production of materials that become part, the fracture, that become part of the manufacture, if I might say, put it that way, of the creative art. So there is a lot of work. Maybe, I don't know if it actually explores the kind of mathematical economics structures that you are talking about, but there is much work on the production of particular materials at particular times, particular papers, or particular forms of paper, or paint, or violinists, for instance, think a lot about the wooden, wood which was used by a very particular kind of wood, then whether you could actually access that wood, what's the market of those, what instruments could be made and could be traded, could be bought. So I think the question is how far you want to take the argument. And I think to have, I think it's important to realize that an omnibus world-resembling theory is often so general, so non-specific, and indeed, in creating that enlargement, it often irons out all the most interesting creases and fragments and contradictions and aporia and undecidability. So I think that I cannot answer this question satisfactorily at the level at which you want it in terms of mathematical economics, but I think that there are many art historians, cultural historians, as I say, even literary historians, who are very interested in production of materials, in book production, the market of books, the notion of audiences, the class from which different kinds of audiences emerge to make certain genres more or less feasible. So I think, it's just a question of how you translate the economistic ideas into the aesthetic ideas. That's the best I can do for you. Yes.
Yes, one last question.
So you keep on going back to these 8 minutes. So I
To what?
understand you keep on going back to these 8 minutes during which
Yes.
George Floyd was killed. And so I understand that the actual vividness of traumatic racism is contained in those 8 minutes, right? But my question is, what if this killing had lasted for an hour, right?
Yeah.
Would it have had the same kind of, echo resonance? And then I was thinking, well, Instagram reels go from, last from like 15 minutes to, 15 seconds to 15 minutes. And of course, Instagram existed in 2020. And so I just wanted to, know whether you think that it would have been the same had it lasted for longer. And sort of the attendant point is temporalities aside, these kinds of, and thinking of deaths that we watch on a daily basis, there's much vividness of traumatic racism in each and every death that we watch, for example, in Gaza. So here you have, the singular death, of George Floyd and the thousands. So I just wanted to, hear your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, of course, I can't tell you that my point is not 8.46 minutes, or as I've said again and again in my talk, the question is what Freud would call a short moment of trauma. That shortness, I happen to have this particular thing at hand, and I could put it in, in other ways. That's why I brought other voices of those whether it's Fanon or Du Bois or Baldwin, who also say there's something happens in the intensity of the shortness which is not worked out. So it has a different temporality. So whether it was an hour or 2 hours, you know, it would not make a difference, because I think I said I'm trying to construct a particular theory of vividness or intensity of time, its politics, its philology, its philosophy, its ontology. That's what I'm focusing on, rather than notions of long-time teleological continuity or evolutionary issues. So it's another way of so the question is not the empirical, if it lasted 1 hour or would it last 8.56 minutes. It's what I could do with that hour. You then raise other questions about singularity, or certain forms of mass death, or large numbers of people. Now, again, the point about George Floyd was not about himself as a person. I said absolutely nothing about him as a person. I was talking about the event, how you structure an event. So I was saying nothing about him as a person, or the value, I mean, of course, about the value of his life, but I was talking about notions of time, value, freedom, injustice, affective identification, anxiety, and ambivalence that come out of a certain situation. There is no doubt that such work could be done around Gaza or around other such events, but it would be, it might not be the kind of work that would be immediately seen as a response to a terrible tragedy. If I was interested in just talking about racism I did a lot of research on race and medical procedures, etc., and then on police on police violence. But that's not what I wanted to write. I wanted to write something where the categories sort of rolled out of some of the things that I brought together and some of the arguments I was making, rather than a large giving you a frame to start with. I mean, this is my real interest in Benjamin. The notion of latency in any language, in any work in Benjamin, is that there are things accede to their legibility. I wrote something about it on latency and this notion of legibility, but I decided it would be too much in the same lecture. So I can't tell you what would have happened. Would I have ever thought that a photograph of Alan Kurdi on that beach in Turkey would have got the EU to prepone, as we say in India, to prepone the council meeting in order to review their procedures for the Mediterranean refugee crossing? Now, do I think that, I mean, there's a whole politics, but also psychopathology to be said about, the fact that the death of one child or the death of one person. But if you just think about it in that way, and there used to be a way of saying, people think if one person dies, they can identify with it. If 30 people die, they can't identify with it. There are these ways of thinking about sort of person-to-person identification. But I've never gone that way myself. I would, and indeed, if you do go that way, there is empirical evidence that Alan Kurdi was not alone. There were 3 other dead bodies, dead children. And the photographer, and that's the interesting issue, decided only to shoot this one child and then the police officer carrying that one body. Now, there's a lot to be unpacked there about what an audience wants, about what things that appeal, in the more romantic notion of childhood, 19th century, of the innocence of death, the death of the innocents in children. So we could build it up like that, but I did not appeal to any of those ideas. In fact, it was the opposite. I didn't appeal to the idea of George Floyd being this, symbol of a black man who is, a part of the throwaway culture of the United States. I didn't go into any of that. It's right. I was just interested in trying to understand psychoanalytically and also politically and culturally a certain kind of temporality of identification and anxiety. That's what I was interested in. Therefore, many of the things I talked about were deeply ambivalent. So, that interests me. How that ambivalence generates more complex forms of identification or description of a time or a place or an event. That's the best I can do.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there may be more questions, but I think this is the moment to stop in view of the time. Please join me in thanking Homi Bhabha.
Thank you.
For
Thank
a
you.
wonderful evening.
Did it go well? Do you think it went well? Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.